Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to welcome so many colleagues from across King's, students, and I think most importantly tonight, alumni, back to King's for our debate and discussion this evening. My name is Cian Murphy and I'm the Academic Co-Director of the Centre for Transnational Legal Studies, which is a collaborative legal education initiative in which our Dixon Poon School of Law is a partner. And it's my great pleasure this evening to chair this panel with three distinguished speakers who I will introduce and who will introduce themselves in a short while. Before I do so, I've been given some good news about the university to share with you. You are all, whether students, staff, alumni, or simply friends of the college, stakeholders in our institution. And I'm sure you will join me in enjoying the good news that we've had in this academic year thus far. Perhaps the biggest headline news about activities here in the university relates to something called the Research Excellence Framework. Now, if you work in the university sector here in Britain, the Research Excellence Framework is forever on your mind. If you don't, it is something that crops up every 5 years. You see a newspaper headline or a BBC News headline, and then you maybe forget about it again. What it is a national audit of research quality and research power in all higher education institutions in Britain. And we have some good news to report in relation to King's performance in the most recent audit, the results of which we had earlier this academic year. King's has risen to 7th for research quality across all disciplines in the United Kingdom, and for 6th overall, risen to 6th overall for research power. And research power is a measure not just of quality, but also of quantity. And so this is really an excellent result for the university in terms of positioning ourselves as one of the world-leading research institutions here in the United Kingdom. Some of you, much like myself, are alumni of the law school, and so I'm sure you'll be particularly happy to know that, to cut quite a long, complicated, and data-heavy story short, we were the best. We came top for research quality across the entire United Kingdom, and we also had the highest proportion of world-leading research in UK law schools in Rev 2014. So these are great news stories for us. They enhance our reputation nationally, but also when international partners, when future international students, and of course our many alumni around the world are looking, they get to have confirmed to them the great position that King's has in terms of doing world-leading research here in the UK. We have, if I can be forgiven a somewhat clumsy pun, built on the success with some recent estates acquisitions, and in particular, the wonderful quarter which, if my geography is right, is behind you and in front of me, a quarter called the Aldwych Quarter, which is those buildings which I think many housed the BBC World Service for several years, but exist between us and Kingsway. Those wonderful buildings including Bush House, including King House and Melbourne House. The expansion of what I understand to be about 300,000 square feet. King Strand Campus will expand to incorporate that quarter over the course of the next 10 years, with us occupying Bush House from September and the appropriately named King House and also Melbourne House from 2025. And this really is a wonderful acquisition for the college at a time when certainly those of us who work here feel every day the constraints as we bring more students, more excellent research and teaching faculty in. This idea that we're going to combine two sets of buildings, if you like, the existing Strand Campus and the Aldwych Quarter together in what will be a real powerhouse of academic learning and research here in the middle of the city. There's also good news for our colleagues from War Studies, both present students, staff, and alumni. And again, having seen the list of those of you who are here with us tonight, I know that we have some War Studies alumni with us. We are happy to announce that King's has launched the Sir Evelyn de Rothschild Scholarships, and those scholarships will kick off in September and come from a gift from Sir Evelyn himself and also from the Aranda Foundation, and we'll see 25 full master's level scholarships awarded by the university over the next 5 years. And as many of you are not just alumni but donors, I hope you will see initiatives like this as evidence of the great benefit that you can bring to what is yours and indeed my own alma mater. Switching back to law for a minute, but maintaining the idea of access to education, our own Dean, Professor David Caron, has asked me to draw your attention to the Law Circle. The Law Circle is a new initiative established about 12 months ago for law donors who are happy to make a regular gift to the university. And as you know, we now receive, as with the Sir Evelyn de Rothschild scholarships, an increasing number of gifts here in the university, and each one has its target. Our big headline gift in law, the Dixon Poon gift, relates to our excellence in leading transnational legal research and global legal education. The Law Circle has taken as its focus access to education to ensure that students who have excellent potential but maybe have not yet, for various circumstances often beyond their control, been able to deliver on that potential, have the opportunity to access a legal education at King's to realise that potential for themselves and for wider society. So we'd very much encourage anyone who might be in a position to consider doing so to speak to either myself or some of our colleagues from the Alumni office after our debate tonight in the reception. We also have a very particular task with which we'd like your help. One of my more enjoyable activities is sitting on a group that's responsible for drafting, collating the information that goes into our annual report, which we submit to the university, to our donor Dixon Poon, and also which we hope to make more and more widely available. And one of the matters which we'd like to do is to engage our alumni to get your reflections on some of the transformations that have taken place in the law school over the course of the past 2.5, 3 years. And so there is attached to the materials given to you tonight a brief "I am happy to be contacted" form. And if you happen to be an alumni of the institution and you happen to be happy to be contacted, perhaps to offer a comment on some of the things that you find interesting or engaging about the changes in the law school over the past 2.5 years, we'd very much encourage you to fill in your name. We don't need a lot by way of contact details because, in keeping with tonight's event, we know who you are. But if you fill in your name and perhaps tick the box relating to whatever it is that you think has really impressed you or interested you about the school over the past 2.5 years or so, and either return it to myself or my colleague from the law school, Dr. Emily Barrett is here. Emily, perhaps you could wave for our colleagues. Afterwards, and we will be in touch with you over the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're putting together the annual report at the moment. Emily and other colleagues in the school are working hard on it, and we'd really like some alumni involvement in that. The final preambulatory announcement is even more immediate, which is that we have a very exciting competition here this evening, a competition which you entered, hopefully, simply by dropping your business card into the goldfish bowl that was outside, where you will get to own the unique King's business card holder. If you are the lucky business card, which I believe I am to draw out of the goldfish bowl at the reception afterwards. Maybe if you haven't already done so, you can take the opportunity to do so at the start of the reception, and you will hold this business card holder, no doubt, in your suit, your briefcase, your purse, whatever it is, and it will be proud, and you will be proud because it's unique, because it is your King's business card holder, which you will have won here this evening. So, that is the news. I feel like I should now give a weather report or something, but that is what's sort of appropriate to do at this moment. But instead, I'm going to briefly tell you who is joining me on the panel and really providing the meat of our discussion here this evening. On my immediate right, I have Professor Sir David Omand, who is a visiting professor in our War Studies department here at King's, and also his current title is Commissioner for the Global Commission on Internet Governance. Professor Sir David Omand has had a long career in relation to intelligence and will no doubt also bring that to bear on our discussion this evening. On Sir David's right, we have Ms. Gail Kent, who is a law enforcement professional with the National Crime Agency. And on Ms. Kent's right, we have Ms. Emma Carr, who, like myself and many of you, is a proud alumni of King's, in particular a Master of Science in Public Service Policy and Management from 2013, and appropriately enough for tonight, is the director of the civil society organisation Big Brother Watch. So before I ask the speakers to explain to you and also to me how their work relates to this topic of internet surveillance and what they think is at stake in the debate, I understand that you have all been polled over the course of the past 2 weeks or so on what you think about internet surveillance. Now, I have to say, after the events of the start of this month, I have very little faith in any polls conducted in this country whatsoever. It seems we're not very good at it and we could work harder at it. But nonetheless, in the hope that our King's polling is perhaps better than that done by other organisations, I can share with you the results. So we had a question: do you feel safer knowing about the existence of mass surveillance programs? Roughly 35% of you said yes, roughly 52% of you said no, and approximately 13.404% of you were unsure. So you'll be happy to know that we don't intend to conduct any formal poll at the end of our discussion, but we can maybe see how you all feel at the drinks receptions afterwards and whether any opinions have been changed one way or the other. The second question, and I have to say I quite like these questions, they were in no way leading at all. The second question was, is it okay for the government to capture data on your online activities? Again, approximately, by my count, 16% of you said yes. Then the more cautious 54% of you said yes in certain circumstances. 28% of you said no, and 3% of you were unsure. So that is where you are, if you like, and what we have over the course of just under an hour is the opportunity to discuss this with some people who work in the field on a daily basis, I think, in pretty much all their cases, and who can bring quite some expert knowledge to bear on the discussion. So it'll be interesting to see if anyone's perception shifts over the course of the hour or so. So what I'm going to ask our speakers to do now is maybe briefly take 2 to 3 minutes to introduce themselves in their own words and to tell us, as they suggested themselves, what they consider to be at stake in this debate. So, Sir David, if I can turn to you first.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Before the clock starts on my 2 to 3 minutes, can I also say, since I'm working in war studies just down the corridor, that if anyone hasn't seen the fantastic Maggie Hambling exhibition on war, her latest work on the subject of war, it's actually in the basement of the Dixon Poon Law Centre, which they've turned into an exhibition space, and it's stunning. It's really,
it is
really
stunning. We're forbidden from calling it the basement. We must call it the lower ground floor.
Right. Okay, let's start the clock. My approach to this subject is as an example of a wicked public policy issue. That's how I approach it. And like all really difficult public policy issues, there are domestic dimensions and international dimensions. There are multiple stakeholders whose interests conflict. Indeed, you could say there are dimensions to the problem which are, frankly, orthogonal. So just to illustrate what I mean, think of 3 different facets of this problem. One is our everyday life on the internet, where I, along with everyone else, wants privacy for my communications. I want very high levels of security for financial transactions. And this first area, this everyday level of our internet use, is the preoccupation, obviously, of the civil libertarians in particular, who want constraints on digital intelligence gathering in that space. The second level, though, is law enforcement, represented by Gail, and that's where the responsibility lies for policing the internet and trying to deal with the worst excesses on the internet, the child abusers and the terrorists and the criminals, proliferators, narcotics gang, people traffickers, you name it. And we need an internet that's safe for its users, but also that's safe for the weaker members of society. So it does need policing. And then there's a third level, the secret intelligence level, which has national security missions, which is supporting the armed forces, which is working on international terrorism. And that's the preoccupation of the agency chiefs who've been out on the public stump complaining about the damage that Edward Snowden has done. There are conflicts between those 3 domains or facets of the problem that can't be reconciled. They can't be wished away. They exist. And the only answer, as with all difficult public policy problems, is to find a solution that gives at least the minimum requirement to each of those 3 levels, because they are all necessary. And that's the approach I've taken. What can one do by way of public policy that gives some satisfaction to each to the stakeholders in each of those three levels. And I'm sure we'll come on in the discussion to debate what exactly those measures should be and what the safeguards should be. And that's my approach, a public policy problem.
Thank you very much, David.
Okay, so I work for the National Crime Agency, which has got the national responsibility in the UK for child sexual exploitation. It also has the National Cybercrime Unit, and we have the national and international responsibility for organised crime affecting the UK. We're also one of the agencies in the UK that carries out lawful intercept, and we do an awful lot of communications data work. And we have taken a coordinating role on behalf of law enforcement in the UK at looking at this debate. So the starting point I wanted to go from was actually what is law enforcement's role in this, and an objection to the term internet surveillance as a starting point, because a lot of this debate has been focused around the intelligence agencies and counter-terrorism work and serious organised crime, when the reality is for law enforcement, the ability to obtain communications data is one of public protection and one of everyday policing. So if you look at the way that law enforcement use communications data, is often to try and locate missing vulnerable people. It's to do investigations into domestic violence, and then also some of the new threats that we have as the internet's developed, so cyberbullying, and as David mentioned as well, sort of child sexual exploitation, which has really, I don't want to use the phrase taken off, but I think it's at a level that really surprises us, even within the community, the amount of time and effort that we're putting into investigating online child sexual exploitation. And we are, within the law enforcement community, grappling with, I think, two issues. One is the way that communication is changing so quickly, and the fact that we're now dealing with individuals who have, and whether that's victims or criminals or people that were perpetrators that we're looking at, or whether that's missing people, we're looking at people that have multiple devices. We all have a huge number of ways in which we can communicate, and we all do that every day. And that isn't just, those companies aren't just ones that are based in the UK. So as David said, we've also got this whole new international dimension, and what are the problems that then presents to us in trying to protect the public. And the second issue that we are grappling with, and it's a very real one as well, is public consent, because policing in this country, if you go back to the Pelian principles, is one of public consent, and we can only police in a way where we have the agreement of the public to carry out what we do. And what does that look like nowadays in the digital age? How do we get those Pelian principles and move them on 200 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Emma.
Hi, so yeah, my name's Emma Carr, and I'm the director of Big Brother Watch. It's really nice to be back. I graduated in 2013 and I've been a part-time master's student here, so it is very nice to be back, even though I was based over in Waterloo. So Big Brother Watch, I'll give you a little bit of insight into what Big Brother Watch is. Unlike a lot of the correspondence that I received would suggest with nothing to do with the television programme. Somebody did set up a change.org petition to lobby me to have the programme removed from the airwaves, which I had to explain I had no power to do. I've got many talents, but that's not one of them. But Big Brother Watch is a civil society campaign group looking at civil liberties and privacy issues, and we were founded in 2009, so we're still a relatively young organisation. And when we first started, we very much focused on offline intrusions into privacy. So at that time it was ID cards, we were looking at CCTV cameras, powers of entry, so powers for council officials to enter people's homes and businesses without a warrant or police presence, those sorts of intrusions. Because of the policy changes over the last 5 years, we've also had to move into the online sphere as well. The two are becoming so interchangeable when you look at the way that CCTV is now turning into things like automatic number plate recognition, facial recognition, those sorts of issues, the use of biometrics in schools. So we started looking into the online sphere. I guess the role of Big Brother Watch, we are pretty grassroots. We try and ask the questions that we think the public want answering, and then we try and answer them in a way that the public will understand. We've been described by companies and by many people working within law enforcement, not so much the intelligence agencies, because we don't speak to them very often. Well, we might speak to them, but they don't speak to us. We've been described as a critical friend. It's our job to ask the questions that when legislation is being drafted, when policies are being discussed, that the civil liberties and privacy issues might not feature, and we want to make sure that those are considered from the beginning until the end, whether it's a company designing a new product, or whether it's the government designing a new piece of legislation. I think privacy by design is something that should be incorporated from the beginning. It's an incredibly, I guess, exciting time to be working in this as a policy area. There's a huge amount going on. There's not quite enough hours in the day. There's 4 of us at Big Brother Watch now. So although we would like to do far more in terms of policy areas, we're unfortunately not able to. But I think that, we've Big Brother Watch have worked with both Sir David and Gail quite a lot over the last few years, and I have to say that I think that within law enforcement and the Home Office and government, they are starting to understand that civil liberties and privacy are important, and they're important to individuals. I mean, I think the polling today suggests that you as audience members would agree with that. I think it's something that's actually starting to come up in conversations between people. It's not becoming a niche issue anymore. We all have to start understanding that our data is being used and we're losing control of it. And we need to start educating ourselves about what that actually means for us as individuals and what that's going to mean for us in the future. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis at Big Brother Watch.
Thank you all. So we have a number of questions here, which we've given our speakers some opportunity to do some homework. And then, of course, I think most importantly, we want to give you the opportunity to ask them some questions. As I was explaining in advance, discussing with our speakers, we are in the Anatomy Lecture Theatre here in King's at the moment. Now, given the profile of the event, I think most of you come from either law or war studies background, so none of us will have taken anatomy lectures here. But this is the old dissection bench. People were dissected on this bench, and so this evening our AV colleague is telling us that that's the old dissection bench. So crucially, in this room right now there is a dissection bench, and this evening it's your opportunity, I think, to dissect some of the arguments which are going to be put forward by our colleagues. And so I think in terms of our first question, our first 2 questions, which I'm going to roll together and maybe direct to Emma in the first instance and then come back to David and Gail, which is what you think about UK surveillance programs and when is it appropriate for intelligence, and perhaps I could roll in here, I think the distinction is important, law enforcement and or intelligence agencies to collect data.
Okay, so from Big Brother Watch's perspective, we advocate targeted, necessary and proportionate surveillance. We come from a standpoint that surveillance as a means of carrying out investigations isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think we just need to know more about how it's being carried out, who it's being carried out by, which individuals in terms of British citizens are being affected, and make sure that the oversight is there and the authorization processes are there. I think we need to get to a place, and we're not there yet, where the public can have complete faith that everything that's being carried out is necessary and proportionate and indeed legal. I think there's still questions that are up in the air about what exactly the capabilities are that our intelligence services and law enforcement have, and I still think there's a lot of confusion about what it is that they're doing with those powers. It certainly doesn't help that the legislation that we currently have was created largely in 2000, so before most social media networks were even being created, certainly before the vast majority of us were using them. So obviously the landscape in terms of how we're communicating has incredibly changed, but the oversight, the authorization, the transparency hasn't necessarily caught up with that. Of course, there's been a lot more conversations over the last few years about how these powers are being used, and it's brought a number of questions, I think, into into the public domain about whether that's actually necessarily proportionate. I think it's been very interesting to see that debate taking place on an international scale, and the difference in reaction from a UK perspective compared to, say, our friends in continental Europe, who were slightly more concerned, I would suggest, immediately about suggestions that illegal spying practices may be taking or may have been taking place. So I don't think necessarily that enough has been done so far to make people aware of the surveillance practices that have been taking place. I don't think there's enough being done in order to educate not only the public but also our parliamentarians as to how the internet works, how surveillance works. If you look at what happened last summer, there was the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act, which was the emergency legislation that was introduced. I think how that was introduced was absolutely appalling, forgetting what was in that piece of legislation, introducing something that was so complex, that was in terms of legal and in terms of the powers, and introducing it over a period of 4 days was appalling, and that was really reflected within Parliament. A lot of the politicians said, we're just not equipped to understand what this actually means, and you're asking us to vote on it. And we're going to do it in good faith, which obviously from my perspective was a little bit irritating. But we need to do far more as citizens to ensure that us and our parliamentarians are equipped to be able to talk about these really important issues that are only going to increase over the next few years.
Thank you. I think, turning to Gail and Sir David, one of the shifts that we've seen in how surveillance technologies are used and how technology is used in general over the course of the past 15 years or so is that a lot of our legal infrastructure, so going back for the lawyers amongst you, Class against Germany, quite an old case now from the European Court of Human Rights, and then the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, were first designed where law enforcement authorities were looking to target a particular individual to carry out surveillance on that individual. And we're now in a situation where there is a belief amongst, I think, some members of our law enforcement authorities and security services that we need powers that allow for broader surveillance, that allow us to not just target particular suspects, but possibly to even identify suspects. And maybe this is the shift that has caused quite a lot of the public controversy over various different surveillance programs over the course of the past, I suppose, 3 or 4 years in terms of public awareness, but civil society and other groups have been looking at it a little bit more. So the question, I think, to you, Gail, and to Sir David is the same about the appropriateness of surveillance, but I feel like, as we discussed with the audience, this tension between looking at suspects and looking at the broader population is probably going to come out as a question to be teased out.
Okay, I sort of starting off and picking up on something that Emma said. I think that education is one of the most important parts of this debate, because whilst there has been a lot of criticism of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which you correctly indicate is the one under which we obtain communications data, and we carry out lawful intercept, and we also carry out directed and intrusive surveillance, which has a very sort of specific meaning in law. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how we do use it, and some of the sort of key parts of it. So I think in terms of we have to remember what are the good parts of RIPA. It's not in any way all bad, and it is very clear to answer your question about targeted, from a law enforcement point of view, targeted interception, targeted obtaining of communications data, that is about an individual. So when we go to obtain communications data on somebody, then we have to very clearly explain the purpose for which we are seeking to obtain that, and why it is necessary and proportionate, and what any intrusion into that individual or any of the people that are connected to that individual is likely to be. And I think that's very much the way that we're looking to continue. So obtaining that information it has to be necessary and proportionate and has to be targeted. I think what you're referring to in terms of looking at the population at large is slightly different, and it's the difference between what data you retain and then your ability to access it. And I think that very much comes back to Sir David's point about how do you balance everything, and how do you make sure that you have the starting point at which you can start an investigation. Now, often, you can start an investigation or locating a missing person or whatever you're trying to do in terms of public protection from a number of starting points. And it is very rare to just have one piece of data that you are likely to then start on. But there are cases in which that happens. And unfortunately, my agency is increasingly dealing with child sexual exploitation. And we talk about it a lot, not because we think that it is that we're trying to scaremonger in any way, but just because I think the sheer volume of it is shocking us on a daily basis. And I think we have to try and find the balance of making sure that in those really, really sort of tiny minority of cases where we only have that one piece of data that is internet data, that we've got the starting point, but we also get the balance between we're not retaining too much data that then means that we could be accused of trying to have that data on everyone. But I think we are I know we are very clear that there is a difference if you're talking about surveillance in the wider term of the word between retaining data and having access to it and then using it.
Thank you. Sir David.
Well, I think my first comment would be, let's not exaggerate. And there's a terrible tendency in discussing this to jump straight into the sort of words you used about about surveilling the broader population, I think was your phrase. The distinction between targeted on the one hand and whatever you want to call it, mass surveillance on the other, is not the right way to look at this. It really isn't. There is no mass surveillance being conducted by either the police or the British intelligence agencies. If you don't believe me, do you believe the judicial commissioners who have full access to it? Do you believe the judges in the independent court, the IPT, who now in 2 judgments come out and said this in terms? So posing that dichotomy is, as it were, a very sloppy way to examine the problem. Talking about surveillance programs is simply framing the issue in a way that is designed to reach a particular kind of answer that favours a particular point of view. If we're in a university, let's just unpack this and think about what is really going on. The first thing is there is indeed targeted surveillance. The Act provides for warrants to be signed on individual persons or premises. There's no real dispute over that power. It is needed. It's exercised. It's essentially designed to look at specific suspects or premises where it is known there is some criminal activity likely to be taking place. And that's not really at issue. But you've then got the third, just take for a moment my third category, national security. So you've got jihadist fighters in Syria and Iraq, you've got Russian paramilitaries in eastern Ukraine, you've got problems all over the globe on which the British government would like to have intelligence. And that's one of the things that the Signals Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, is tasked with providing. The Act gives them the authority to do that through a system of warrants signed by the Foreign Secretary. That is targeted because we know the purposes for which the intelligence is being gathered. There are requirements which have been authorized, but it's not targeted in the same way as you target domestically when you actually have the name of the criminal you can put on the domestic warrant. So bear in mind, we're talking about support to the armed forces, we're talking about national intelligence as well as the domestic sphere. There's been a lot of ink spilt on the question of bulk access to data. In particular, bulk access to acquired communication data. That is targeted, but it's targeted in a different way. So what happens, there is a terrorist incident, or through one means or another, the agencies, or it could be the police if it's a criminal matter, come to have in their possession information about a suspect. It might be the IP address or the dynamic address that they use to communicate. It could be a telephone number, who knows. But there's a seed there, as they call it, SEED, which can then be used to try and work out who is that individual in touch with, do they have a network, where are they, what are their intentions, and is there indeed some form of organized activity going on, whether it's terrorism or criminal activity. To do that, you need access to the communications. It's a global packet switch network. You need access to quite a lot of the communications, but you've got a starting point. This is not, repeat not, about mass surveillance of the population in the hope of finding somebody who is thinking impure thoughts or having impure deeds. This is about starting a process of investigation to try and uncover whatever is going on. Something like an IP address is a very good starting point, but then you have to find the communications. Now this is where Gail's point comes in about retention of data. And actually its retention of data is actually a much more significant issue, and should be for all of us, than the fact that the agencies are trying to uncover these networks. Because what happens is you have a starting point at a point in time. You've suddenly got this information. What you want to know is not that you want to do is not spend the next 3 months trying to monitor that. You want to go back 3 months and see who was that individual in touch with. And then you can begin to very quickly establish, is this worth further investigation? So retention of data, communication data, so you can see who called whom, when and where, which is allowed for under the Act, is a hugely powerful tool in the hands of law enforcement and the hands of intelligence agencies. Obviously, it is subject to the same restraints in the law, proportionality and necessity. These are legal requirements that are in the Act. But you do need to have access to the data. And that's where the, I think, very foolishly named Snoopers Charter. It's not a Snoopers Charter at all. It's not, that legislation was never designed to snoop on the population. It was designed to give a fighting chance, in some circumstances, the authorities to be able to uncover a network. There's then an empirical issue, which I'm not in a position to solve, which is how long do you need to keep data in order for it to have its effect. A week would not work. You might not be that far advanced in your inquiry. Forever is too long, and somewhere around probably a year or 18 months or 2 years is probably about the optimum. Keep it for longer than that, it's unlikely to actually be of very much use. And that's an empirical matter. We can't solve it in abstract. You can only do that by getting the kind of data together that actually illustrates the question. But just to sum up, there is no mass surveillance. Put that idea completely out of your minds and don't listen to people who are trying to persuade you. Just think of the law enforcers and the intelligence officers. There aren't enough of them to do what society expects. The last thing they want to do is to think about the population at large. They want to narrow down as quickly as possible to the genuine suspects. But that, in law enforcement, it is necessary sometimes to investigate the innocent in order to find out who did actually commit the murder is a truism in every detective novel that I know.
And can I just add something to that? I mean, I think one of the things that we often, or two things we often forget is that actually, and we're doing some work on the statistics around this, the number of crimes that where you do use communications data is pretty small, but the crimes in which you do use it to try and solve them are really significant, or it is really significant. But communications data is often also used by the defence to prove their case and to prove alibis and to help prove innocence. And I think we shouldn't always look at it as something that is used to only prove guilt.
Can I just add, in case anyone thinks that I'm a spokesperson for officialdom, I am speaking with my academic hat on. But on your second question, have they done enough to bring information into the public sphere? I would join Emma in saying, no, they certainly haven't. And the one thing that the independent court found against the government was that it hadn't explained how the various safeguards work when you come to intercept information on global networks pertaining to UK citizens. And there was absolutely no reason why they shouldn't have explained it, and they have now explained it. But for that period in which they hadn't explained it, for those of you who are policy wonks on the ECHR, they were in breach of the European Convention because they hadn't explained how the law actually applied.
I think it's one of the thoughts which strikes me as over those interventions is that in the course of the past 15 years or so, we've maybe seen, again at the risk of introducing dichotomies that might sensationalize rather than illuminate, but we've seen a sort of a blurring between, on the one hand, intelligence, which we consider to be appropriate use for the basis for military action, and then on the other hand, criminal justice evidence, which has to comply with certain rules to be admissible in court. We see something of a blurring of the perhaps always slightly facetious distinction between internal security matters, including, let's say, crime broadly understood, and then external security matters about Britain's security within the world. And I think that some of the legal problems that have arisen have partly arisen because of the different regimes that maybe govern those, and how difficult it has been as the public becomes more aware of certain regimes which offer under certain legal systems or certain legal infrastructures being slightly different others. But there could be reasons for those distinctions, and it's maybe one of our tasks is to try and unpack what distinctions we need to keep and what distinctions we need to be willing to elide.
But can I sort of throw a point around? I'd be interested in views from the audience on this, because we've traditionally made the distinction between the domestic population and everyone else. And the domestic population is not just UK nationals, but anyone who happens to be within the territory has a certain level of, as it were, legal protection. Outside, it's, as it were, a lower standard. And I don't know of any country that doesn't apply that rule. But when you think about the universality of human rights, including rights to privacy, you then have to say, actually, the principles of proportionality and necessity and legal authority, right authority, must apply everywhere. And that's quite interesting to then think about in legal terms, how you argue that through.
So I think this is something that would be interesting to hear from the audience on in a moment, in this question which has been posed in other areas of law: should the Constitution stop at the water's edge? And even that is, of course, difficult because, as you would know better than I, information may pass through the UK, never quite resting here, but is accessible. So these questions of territoriality as a matter of law have become quite complex. But before I go to the audience for some questions, I would have, I think I have a question for Emma, which is that there seems to be some agreement in the panel that part of what we could do better in this state is better inform the public about what surveillance is undertaken, the conditions under which it's undertaken, and the safeguards that there are against either accidental misuses or in extremis deliberate misuses of power. So from your point of view, what do you think you would like to be out there? What sort of information you think should be in the public domain that isn't?
Everything.
Everything.
Everything to a point. I think if one way of looking at it, if you look at our friends in the US and the amount of information that is available there in comparison to here, we're certainly getting better. If you look at the latest Interception and Communications Commissioner's report, it makes very exciting reading. It's far more detailed than we've ever seen before in terms of statistics around how many times communications data is requested, around rejections, around authorizations. But we could definitely get much more granular information. I'd be very interested to know what sorts of crimes are these powers being used for. I'd be very interested in terms of individuals. One of the things that we campaign for at Big Brother Watch is the rights around redress. As I explained at the beginning, we started looking at the uses of surveillance powers in an offline context. We were looking at how RIPA was being used by local authorities, and through Freedom of Information we were exposing that some local authorities were using it to investigate House of Horrors, to spy on people fly tipping, the kinds of powers that people would expect GCHQ and the NCA to be using, but not necessarily a local authority. And we had to go out there and get that information and expose it. It wasn't being put in the public domain out of their own free will. So it's about not necessarily saying the way that these powers are being used is right or wrong, but putting that information in the public domain so the public can make that decision. This has to be about consent, and it has to be about informed consent. This can't be something where it's a one-sided conversation, and I'm afraid up until this point it very much has been. There's been mud thrown at the law enforcement intelligence agencies for the way that they've been using powers, rightly or wrongly. But we've had a very one-sided debate in terms of whether that was correct or not. When that is ever debated in Parliament, we're faced with, we don't comment on issues of national security. So that's incredibly frustrating. If Parliament, if these guys want to have the public on board with what they're doing, if they do want to increase the powers that they have, they need to start having that debate with us and with the public. Otherwise, there will always be that suspicion there that the powers that they have or the powers that they want in the future aren't going to necessarily be used for the correct reasons.
I'll take a brief word from Gail and Dave, and then I'm going to throw it up. But a brief thought.
Can I have 3 brief thoughts? Is that terrible?
Perhaps if you could make their brevity.
So they will be extremely brief. Yes to transparency and making it clear the type of crimes that we're using them for, so that we can at least get away from this dichotomy of we're either using it for fly tipping or CT, because most of it is in the middle. Secondly, I don't think we've ever asked for an increase of powers. It's just our ability to maintain the access to the who, where, when and how of how people are communicating. And the third point is about the sort of international dimension. I think that what is often lost in that international dimension is victims. Because now, when I'm trying to get communications data on so whether it's identifying where a missing person is or any of the investigations that we're doing, I'm most of the time having to apply to a company that's in the US. So what that means is that it's no longer British law that applies, it's US law that applies. And so it's not just that we should be applying our own law to people that we may or may not be targeting outside of the UK. I think we also have to make sure that our own law is consistently applying to victims on behalf of whom we are investigating in the UK, and that it's not US law that trumps our law.
A couple of very quick points. I think it's fundamental, if we're living under the rule of law, that there can be no secret law. And we haven't got secret law, but what we do have is an act that even very good QCs find very difficult to construe. And it's an interesting question. I was the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office when we put this act together and launched it, put the bill together and launched it. It was very difficult for parliamentary draftsmen to actually craft the act. And if it's going to be replaced by another one, it will be also very difficult. And the solution he came up to was not, do not try and write legislation that the ordinary public will just be able to read and understand. Put it in a parliamentary approved code of practice, where in plain English you can take all the space you need to explain it. And so I think if the code of practice had been updated some years ago for the internet age, a lot of the trouble and misunderstandings we've had could have been avoided. But I'm slightly reluctant to go down the line to say you can simply write law that is going to be comprehensible to the lay person when it's a subject as complex as this. I say good lawyers did try, but they found it difficult. Second point is I draw a distinction between transparency and translucency. To talk about complete transparency in the world of policing and intelligence is nonsense.
Yeah.
By definition, you're trying to obtain information which the people who have the information don't want you to have, the criminals, the terrorists. So, by definition, if you reveal exactly what you are doing, you will never get the intelligence on which you can base law enforcement action. But translucency is different. Translucency is a frosted glass. You can see through it. You can see the movement of the people. You know that roughly what is going on, but you can't see all the details. And so I would make a point that, I think Emma agrees with this. You can't actually have just a window completely into.
But about having faith in the person who's erected that glass and trusting the information that's been put on the other side of it.
And I think one of the great challenges we've had is this question of trust. Both I think there's a real challenge in trust in political actors and the organs of government generally, both in this country and more widely at the moment. And then I think that partly that has fed into challenges of trust for law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies as well. But I think it's time to trust our audience to ask some questions. So we have some roving microphones. I'm going to ask you to tell us who you are, so your name, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you want to tell us what year you gloriously graduated from King's, or whether you want to tell us who your current employer is or why you're interested in this area or whatever. But a name and some kind of affiliation. And if you could wait for the microphone, because we are recording the event, so it would be great if we can pick up your question on record. In saying that, I've now silenced you all, because no one wants to go on record. We have a gentleman here in the front. Thomas Reid.
Just to break the ice, Thomas Reid from War Studies. I'm not actually teaching here. Simplified, there are probably two sources for communications data. Intercept, bulk intercept, one, and getting the data from a communication service provider, which is probably more common. Now, it's quite easy to defeat both by encryption, either regular encryption or end-to-end encryption. How useful, question for Gail Kent, how useful is bulk intercept actually? Because it doesn't seem to be that useful.
I don't think that's a question for me, because we don't carry out bulk intercept as Sir David indicated. Encryption is a good thing. We have the National Cybercrime Unit in our as part of the National Crime Agency, and undoubtedly good encryption prevents a lot of cybercrime. And when you're protecting your data, or a bank or a company is protecting your data, it's very important that that is protected properly. I think in terms of, there will always be people that will use the most sophisticated means of evading law enforcement and evading the intelligence agencies. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't value the data that we get where we're investigating crimes or looking for victims where that isn't the case. I think one of the points, though, that we have also sort of talked about publicly is, should there be any areas of the internet which are absolutely closed doors to law enforcement and the intelligence agencies? And I think for us that's another difficult conundrum to try and get through. And I think that there are a number of different solutions that are worth looking at for that. And I don't think there's sort of a big assumption that we should rush to backdoors and weak encryption. And I don't think we're arguing for that, but I think we're arguing for a discussion as to whether that should be the case. And if that shouldn't be the case, and you wouldn't expect, you know, in the physical world to have areas that were no-go areas, what are the solutions to that?
Yeah, just to comment, I think my case on this would certainly rest on front doors, not back doors, not weakening of encryption, but how far can you get by legislating to compel the service providers to retain certain kinds of information. After all, packets have headers. The information is there. If it wasn't there, the packets would never arrive and be reassembled. So actually, it's just talking about encryption. That's too general. I think you have to. But I mean, if you're trying to steal the information, that's a different matter. But if you're working with the cooperation, as I hope we will be, because I think Gail's point is very important. Are we really saying that we as society are comfortable about there being a whole set of media communication for which law enforcement has no means of access? That's quite a big statement to make, that there is a law-free zone. It doesn't apply anywhere else in our life. Law enforcement with a proper warrant can get at your bank account, they can check up all sorts of information, and we accept that. So why in this one area would we put our hands up and say it's too difficult? I'm not saying it will be easy, and I'm not saying that all the service providers will necessarily cooperate, and some of them will be delivering international services which are not actually based in the UK in any way, and therefore might be difficult to catch with legislation. But it would get you quite a long way to have that kind of cooperation. And that's what we've enjoyed for years and years and years with the telecommunications companies. And they've cooperated fully. It's the over-the-top services who are now proving more hesitant about having that kind of obligation. But if you deliver a service and make gazillions of dollars profit from producing this service in the UK, I don't see why you shouldn't be subject to UK law on the matter.
Yeah, one of the interesting debates, which I think there was a sort of a stalemate reached in relation to the European legislation, which was until recently in force in relation to this, was whether compensation should be provided to private actors for facilitating this. And I think there was a stalemate in Europe, and it was left to national authorities to decide, national legislatures really, whether they were going to provide for compensation or not. But I think the role of the private sector in this is interesting, because on the one hand, there are organisations or companies which are keen to be cooperative, and then on the other there are those which are resistant, sometimes from a sort of a sense of, I think, public relations, a concern that they'll be seen to be complicit in law enforcement. And then sometimes I also wonder whether there's just a cost consideration that they're concerned about that. I wonder if, Emma, I don't know if you've a thought on, from your point of view, the effectiveness of bulk collection. I assume Big Brother Watch does not collect bulk data.
No.
But if you have a thought, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, maybe we could gather a couple of questions and then come back to the panel.
I'd just say on the encryption issue, I think those two responses are two of the most sensible kind of answers to the encryption problem that I've heard. And one of the things that I get incredibly irritated by is this kind of schizophrenic policy making, and that seems to be coming out of the government around issues like encryption, mainly because the people who are talking about it don't understand it. When you've got people talking about the need to weaken encryption, the need to be able to access things, the need to remove encryption even, whilst also talking about putting £45 million into the Internet of Things, the importance of the financial sector, improving our cybersecurity. I think there needs to be a little bit of joined up thinking going on. And you know, if they had any sense, they'd be listening to people like Gail and Sir David, and to actually talk to people, talk to the technologists, talk to the companies even who are using this sort of technology to look for legal and transparent solutions. And I think any suggestion that any government, whether it's ours or anybody else's, should be weakening the infrastructure of the internet to steal our information rather than looking to, you know, improve the MLAT system, for instance, I think is really barking up the wrong tree.
Thank you. So further questions I have a list of them in front of me, but I really don't want to monopolise our speakers' time. This gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Gary Hawkins. I'm a guest of the Alumni, so thank you for your hospitality. I'm an InfoSec analyst in the general insurance market. Now, the communications data bill is going to see an increase in the data that is retained. Now, whether you want to call that mass surveillance or not is largely academic. That information in the wrong hands could well be detrimental to individuals, not necessarily breaking the law, but cause a cause of embarrassment. Given that the number of companies suffering data breaches is only increasing, most telcos have already made headlines for the wrong reasons. Even police forces and soccer have mishandled data. What confidence can we have as the public that this information is only going to be seen by those that have a legitimate reason to see it?
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to take a couple of questions before returning to the panel if there are others who'd like to come in. Gentleman here in the front.
I'm just intrigued. David Burns. I did defence studies back in 2002, a master's. I'm just intrigued why, picking up on the issue of trust, and I think the word Emma used at one point was faith, why the public should have to have a different degree of faith or trust surrounding the governance of this particular issue over, I don't know, say an intimate understanding of nuclear reactor design or aviation engine design or any other issue. Is it just a de jure issue, or what is the evidence that this issue demands more public trust than any other issue where their personal safety or liberty is involved?
And so maybe if I could ask you, do you think that there is less public trust in the government in relation to this issue than other issues?
I think, yes, I think because for example, the function that Emma's organisation performs is perfectly laudable, but to describe it as Big Brother Watch is an emotive name for an organisation in the first place. If it's a question of public accountability and oversight, that's much less emotive. And I think this is one of those issues where it is pushed to the fore and it's easy for people to understand, and they tend to focus on that to the exclusion of other issues which are equally relevant in their everyday lives. And I think sometimes the degree to which interested parties in the debate claim that the public are concerned may in fact be overstated, because the public are probably more concerned about the negative aspects of crime on the internet than they are about the potential for the government to impact on their lives.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps I could take a third gentleman here. And we've another gentleman in the middle. The gentlemen are very loquacious. Perhaps the ladies could join us in the question asking.
I'm just a guest. I just want to kind of do a question for the young people here, which would be, so obviously you guys say that legislation that we rolled out, 10 years ago wasn't very kind of far-sighted. So my question is going to be, in the next 10, 20 years, when there's more data, the internet is more pervasive, there is even more things you can surveil, what is the government going to do, and what does legislation have to do to take this into account? And that this isn't going to stop, this is a constant issue, so what do we do basically?
Okay, so I'll look to the future, and then I'm going to take the gentleman in the middle and come back to the panel, and then perhaps we can get quickly one more round of questions.
Hello, Edward Smith, War Studies alumnus and also a lawyer. I'd quite like to see ask basically the panel whether they think the issue of law enforcement and intelligence powers should be greatly separated, and that conflating law enforcement with the acquiring of secret intelligence is often one of the reasons why, and I think I was in discussion of the gentleman down there's point, there's an issue of trust, and I think Gail Kent mentioned Pelian concepts of consent. The law, in terms of law enforcement, requires consent. The security and secret intelligence doesn't and never has done. And should we have this mixing of powers by both the police and the secret intelligence services.
Okay, so I think several of those interventions relate really to this question of trust, maybe partly in relation to the idea that even if we have heavily regulated law enforcement and intelligence and other security services, what is perhaps innovative about some of the tools that are being made available is we're relying on the private sector to retain data, which would then be selectively made available to law enforcement. And I suppose part of the question is, can we rely on the private sector to retain data without accidentally or otherwise releasing it? And then I think there's this broader question of trust, and then perhaps turning to Emma, the question, 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. Why Big Brother watch? Can we not just accept that in this area as well as other areas government is going to exercise some powers, and we need, for better or worse, to trust in government? So I think trust for the private sector, trust for the agencies, and also the question of trust in government. I think maybe if I take you each in turn, David.
Quick comment. The point about security of data is absolutely right. This is going to need continual attention. But the private sector, of course, already has orders of magnitude more data about us than government ever will. Because that's how the internet works. It's the monetization of our data. That's why the services are free on the internet, is because money is made by taking our data and putting it to use, monetizing it. Companies have been broken into, and they are beginning to learn the serious lesson that this is financially a very bad place to be. So I'm reasonably confident that private sector data security of the sort of companies we're talking about is certainly going to be good. I think conflating two of the questions, I think we should separate out, are we talking about now and whether we are confident in the arrangements now, or are we talking about these are powerful tools? Are we confident that under a future government of a very odd kind that we might elect, that actually they won't be misused? And these are different questions, and they have different policy answers. I am personally completely confident about the now position. We are not under mass surveillance. The judges do a very good job. The court does a very good job. Ministers and the various inspectors that go in do a very good job. Am I confident that these tools might never be misused? That depends on the oversight mechanisms and the parliamentary oversight mechanisms and the state of the legislation. And there's work to be done on all of those, and I think Emma would agree. There's been a sea change relating to public interest, stroke public trust in all of this. The intelligence world in the old days collected intelligence on national security targets. It didn't affect the public. We avoided World War III. The public therefore had, for the most part, no need to know and no particular interest, as long as they were confident that the agencies were going off chasing after the KGB or whatever it was. All that changed when intelligence started to be used for public protection, because then the public did start to ask, and we've seen this, Lee Rigby is the latest tragic case, what was being done in our name, should it have been stopped, what did they know, who knew what? Put that together with the ECHR and the requirement for a legal structure to govern intelligence as well as law enforcement, which is a series of cases, is very clear. Put that together with the loss of deference generally, and I think you've got the issue where this is now being talked about. Personally, I think the current fuss about this is just simply a moral panic based on the Snowden revelations, which came as a terrible surprise to a lot of people. It shouldn't have come to as any surprise to anyone who studied war studies, because there's quite a lot already in the public domain about this. But that just blew it up. The last time this happened was the Mazzini case in 1844, I think, when Parliament had a moral crisis and shut down the deciphering branch and pensioned off our cryptanalysts. So we entered the First World War without a cryptanalytic capability because Parliament had shut it down in excess of moral zeal. I hope that won't happen today. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gail.
So in terms of sort of, is it an issue du jour, I think that people are possibly more interested in this because they feel it's about them. I think we're all aware of how much data that we put online. And I think also, to answer part of the question about law enforcement and the intelligence agencies, much as I love programmes like CSI and NCIS and 24, that isn't the reality. I absolutely wish that I could just get an iPad and swipe it and flick things up there. But the truth is that people forget their passwords and spend ages logging in, and there are endless forms that we have to fill out, quite rightly, to gain access to this information. So I think there is a big sort of conflict between the idea that we can obtain everyone's private information and know everything with the reality, which I think comes back to the question about education and making sure that the reality of both law enforcement and the intelligence agency is understood both in public and I think critically in Parliament. And in terms of sort of like what does the future look like, I sort of come back to my opening remarks. I think as long as we are remembering that law enforcement is by public consent and those Pelian principles, then I'd hope that the principles of necessity and proportionality will always be there. But I don't think that we should hide from the fact, and Sir David's written about this as well, about the fact that there is a lot more data out there than there ever has been before, and there is also therefore a lot of demand for that data. So if you're investigating a crime nowadays, whether it's a stolen iPad or whether it's a burglary or anything, then there is the victim that you're talking to knows the data that they have that could indicate where that iPad is or where that device is, and that's something that they're also expecting us to respond to.
Emma.
I think I completely agree with Gail in terms of why do people care about this as an issue as opposed to other issues, and it's to do with relevance of their lives. If you look at something like medical records, people have a hugely strong view about whether their medical records should remain private or not. If you look at the care.data scheme, which was they were going to share medical records for research purposes, people got very upset very quickly, and that was all because what was going to happen to the medical records wasn't explained to them properly. It was done by a leaflet, it was generic, it didn't really explain what a researcher was, what the NHS was, and that led to the scheme being paused, and it has been for the last 18 months. And that's because people had this very strong idea as to, I have a conversation with my doctor writes it down, and that should be that. This idea that anybody else should be able to see that was immediately understandable and upsetting to them. And when you look at it from an online context, I think you see the trust that people have and the interest that people have in this being very similar. People will see things like their emails, their direct messages, those sorts of communications as being, I think, one level of privacy, and tweets or something similar as being another sort of privacy. And I think people are only just starting to understand that actually what they're communicating about themselves online is their own work. I think it was the head of the CIA who said, the Facebooks and Googles of this world have created a database on all of us that the intelligence agencies couldn't have dreamed of gathering about all of us. And we have done that. I'm as guilty of that as everybody else. I have a social media profile on just about everything you can possibly imagine. But we need to start thinking, and this goes back to education, about what it is that we're putting out there, the conversations that we're having online, and the repercussions that might have for our offline lives. I think that's something, going back to the kind of the encryption conversation we had earlier, it's something that we need to start discussing more at a policy level, at a public level, certainly at a school level. And it was interesting to see the news that certain levels of cybersecurity are going to be taught at GCSE. I think this needs to become far more fundamental in terms of what is it that we're sharing about ourselves, whether it be our medical records, whether it be on Facebook, whether it be a form that we're filling out and giving to someone in the public sector, who's having access to that information and what are the repercussions. Because unfortunately, that is the way that the direction in terms of data is moving. It's valuable for law enforcement, it's valuable for the intelligence services, it's also valuable for companies to make money from. We have become a commodity. So we need to become much more savvy in terms of how our data is being used in a multitude of contexts.
Thank you. I'm happy to take one final question if there is one. Lady here, and then the lady here, and then I'm going to give the panel about 2 minutes to address these questions each, and then I'm also conscious of the gentleman in the middle. I think it was the gentleman in the middle, one of our earlier questions, which is, flash forward 10 years, where are we going to be? Lady here.
Well, what I wanted to say is that I understand why people care about the data that the government is looking at. But what I don't understand, and I think the government's letting itself down a little bit, is why they're not saying that the reason why they're doing this, I think Sir David touched on it slightly, is for the security of the nation. And it looks like that what Gail said is that everyone's got this data on the internet anyway. And what we're saying is that everyone can have access to this data except the government. And I do agree that there should be more safeguards, that the government needs to, put safeguards, because we don't want the Chinese, for example, getting hold of all our data. But saying that, the government shouldn't, intervene on the internet, to me, is just ludicrous. And we're in 21st century Britain, and it's not the same as the 19th century. It's no longer a safe place. So the government better wake up, in short.
Thank you very much. And lady here.
Hi, I'm Valerie Taylor, a law graduate from 1990 and a privacy lawyer now. My question is a slight, kind of following on from that, but a slight flip of what we've been talking about. So if we're persuaded that the law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies have appropriate powers which they're using properly, how are those agencies protecting us as UK citizens against other governments and commercial organisations from accessing the data that they are carefully not looking at?
Thank you. So both interventions bring up this question of cyber warfare, really, and the need for cyber defence. So I should say I have allowed us to go way over time, because as an academic I find this fascinating and I'm perfectly happy to discuss forever. So I'm going to ask our panellists to be faithful to a 2.5 minute interjection, so we can continue this over wine and, crucially, the business card draw next door. David.
Oh, well, 10 years on, there will be, 4 or 5 billion people connected together, any one of whom can communicate instantly with any of the others. Plus, I don't know how many billion things in the Internet of Things. So we've already mortgaged our future to the Internet. We can't exist without it. Industry would collapse without it, so would commerce. So it has to be protected. And I think we've got to get that right. It will be very difficult to protect ourselves from aggressive criminals and aggressive states. There is no international law forbidding espionage, and there never will be. We use espionage because we have interests we have to defend too. So you've just got to be smart. And we will have to spend, I think, we might find in 10 years' time, the major mission of the intelligence community is defensive. It's actually trying to get into the intelligence space to actually thwart the people who are trying to get at us. That would be my prediction.
Thank you. Gail.
I think that we have to remember that we're right at the start of the internet, and if you look at what happened with the printing press, we would never have had any idea what that would have led to. So I think we do have an amazing opportunity to get this right if we do it thoughtfully, and it is about balancing. Okay, what is the what is the threat, how can we make sure that we're as secure as possible, how can we not limit, as the lady over there pointed out, legitimate access to data to investigate crimes and protect people. But I think the third element that we have to very much be aware of is about keeping the internet a free and open place. And that when we're balancing protecting and gaining access, we're also not doing anything that is in any way sort of harming a free and open internet that has brought about the benefits that we all enjoy today.
Thank you. Emma, final word to you.
To answer this lady's question, I see security and privacy as being complementary, not something that necessarily has to be in opposition. I don't think you can have one without the other. I think that you're right. The reasons behind why the government does what the government wants to do aren't necessarily very well communicated. Again, that goes back to the conversation we're having about encryption, and some of the rhetoric being in direct conflict to their rhetoric around cybersecurity, about the financial sector. It's got to do about being clear and about being informed and about being smart in terms of when they choose to communicate and how they choose to communicate. In terms of how the agencies are going to look after us, I think the UK is already way behind where it should be in terms of our sophistication when it comes to cybersecurity, considering that cybersecurity was only made kind of the fifth domain of defence relatively recently. If you look at the relatively small cybersecurity budget that we have in this country, we're only really starting to get to a point where the private sector and the public sector are collaborating really on intelligence sharing about the threats that they pose and how to combat them. If you look in comparison even to the US, we are way behind. We need to start really picking up on that. I think that is where we need to start looking in terms of the future. That's where my huge concerns lie. It's not necessarily to do with what we've been talking about this evening. It's to do about how our infrastructure, our critical national infrastructure, that is the internet, is being used not only in this country but around the world, and how on an international basis we start creating some norms that we can all adhere to.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to join me in a moment in thanking our speakers. I've been instructed to sum up, and it seems to me that what has come out really is that the public needs to make some choices. We need to make choices about what we make available online, which is largely happening making information available to private sector actors, and then choices about what access we want government to have to that information, both for the prevention of crime and more broadly for matters of security. I think in doing that we need a lot of information, and I'd like to, I think, commend our speakers here tonight in providing us with information and having an informed debate. It often feels like a sense of debate about something as it takes place in a lot of our media today is about getting two people who have extreme positions that they can articulate in 15 seconds and therefore give us the sense that we've had a balanced debate, and that rarely, it would seem to me, helpfully advances the discussion. And so I'd very much like to thank Sir David, Gail and Emma for giving us an informed, articulate and considered discussion here today. What is it, believe it or not in my briefing, but I'm sure you'll all agree is essential, is to thank Amy Webb and Alyssa Martin, who work in our alumni office and who are really responsible for the organisation of tonight's debate, and we'll thank them in a moment. They've asked me to draw two more things to your attention. One is the Alumni Weekend, which takes place from the 12th to the 14th of June, and there's information in your handout about that, and we'd very much like to encourage you to come and join in the activities of the alumni event, or the alumni weekend, and meet your fellow alumni. There's also an opportunity for you to get involved, and this is something which is quite important to me as someone who spends my days dealing with our students, and that is mentoring. We have a program called King's Connect, which is an online community that gives you as alumni the opportunity to mentor current students and also to connect with your fellow alumni around the world. It only requires a commitment of about an hour to 2 hours per month, and in addition to what you give, you of course receive, and there's an opportunity to access special mentoring events which are exclusive to those involved in the programme. We've got about 700 members in King's Connect as it is, and if you'd like any further information, please take a look at the handout in front of you or contact Amy or Alyssa in the reception afterwards. My final thanks is to you, our students. who are the people who we educate here, have of course a stake in the university, whether it's for 1 year as a master's student or 3 years as an undergraduate or PhD. But really, it's the students that choose in becoming alumni to be active alumni that are the real lifeblood of the university. You are the ones who carry King's around with you on a daily basis once you graduate from here and move out into the world, and who speak about your experiences at King's, and in many of cases who donate either your time, your money, or simply your attendance here to help this be a thriving university. And it is for you essentially that my colleagues and I, including Sir David and others who are here in the audience, come to work every day in helping to continue to make this institution what it has been when I was educated here, and what we hope, whatever the internet will be like in 10 years, King's will still be here, still growing and still providing world-class education and research. So I'd very much like to thank you and welcome you to join us in the reception next door.